Hey folks, we have an incredibly informative short video for you today that relates to the viral issue. I'm being extremely careful what kind of material I put on this platform after some challenges over the past year. So this one is perfect Israel study data, and it relates to vitamin D and the risk for severe COVID outcomes. So I'm steering clear of anything too controversial, and but it's amazing data. And I'll also tie it back to videos I released in April 2020. Many studies at the time came out saying the same thing. So no surprises for me, but I think you'll find it really fascinating. And again, thanks so much to my Patreon and PayPal supporters. That's what keeps me researching, keeps me getting the data out there. And other material I've recently been releasing on other platforms, you can find the link down below. That we'll go through more controversial, if you will, government data and science, still all 100% referenced, absolutely accurate, but maybe just a little bit too problematic for certain platforms. So the link to my Odyssey channel is down below. So enjoy this one on vitamin D and the risk for COVID severity of outcome and even mortality. And I believe it has a huge lesson to tell us all. So please do share and subscribe and get the data out there. Thank you. Okay, here we go, folks. February 3rd, 2022, Israel came out with this in the Times of Israel, so it's mainstream. Israeli study offers strongest proof yet of vitamin D's power to fight COVID. But we got to be careful here. This is an associational study. It does not prove that chugging pills prevents you having a severe outcome, but it shows something profound, which I'll explain properly now. So it's been in the Mail Online in the UK as well, so this is mainstream stuff and I'm just going through the data, but profound implications for this. So here's the top line data from the study itself, there it is, and you can see that if I put in the line for where I would say human ancestral healthy level would be, and I'll show you the data on that shortly, you should be above this red line or around this red line. But you can see the mild cases are below the line, but not too bad. They're around 30 nanograms. The moderate cases are right down at 20, which is insufficient on average. Severe, pretty much in the toilet for vitamin D, and critical, absolutely in the toilet, unsurprisingly. Now, I went through this in great detail based on several studies back in April, 27th of April, 2020, right? And nothing has changed. The Israeli study pretty much comes out with the exact same data, inferences, and implications. So I think it's a case of, in fairness, correct again, Ivor. Not to be arrogant, but on nearly every vector of this challenge over the last couple of years, I've been largely correct, where we've seen a lot of incorrect information coming from mainstream sources, to be quite honest. But anyway, we'll let that go. So here's the table from the study, and the key thing here is that they didn't just measure in the hospital where you could say that, oh, but the vitamin D dropped because the people were ill. They measured in the hospital. They measured for a long period beforehand, nearly 2 years in many people, and they also used a Costner model, which corrects the current values for the seasonal variation over the last couple of years. So they did multiple ways of getting the true vitamin D status of the person prior to infection. Did a great job. None of these different methods changed the outcome, by the way. So it's nothing to do with having a lower vitamin D because you were ill. Nothing at all. We'll show one other brief data table, and the point I just want to make here is they were very aware of comorbidities, i.e., well, people with a lot of comorbidities have low vitamin D, and maybe it's the comorbidities more so. Nope. The risk multipliers for the comorbidities were actually quite small when you compared to vitamin D status itself, and the vitamin D is what gave the risk multiplier. And you can see at a glance here that, yeah, low vitamin D people are unhealthier, and they do have more comorbidities, but the comorbidities are actually well spread across all the vitamin D categories. So that's not a criticism. So we'll show you the results. Normal vitamin D, what I would call normal, above 40 nanogram, is the 1 times risk factor, it's the baseline. Sufficient, 30 to 40 nanogram, is pretty much you're as well off, 1.1 times the risk. It's around the same as the risk supposedly for meat causing cancer, but this is a tiny associational risk, so you'd call them pretty much the same. Insufficient then, 20 to 30 nanogram. Now you have around 2.5 times the risk of being a severe case or critical case. So that's substantial in an associational study. But deficient, below 20 nanogram, where you really got problems, 14 times the risk of being a severe or critical case. I mean, wow. For an associational study, this is an enormous risk factor. 2 times is pretty big for this kind of study. 14 times is out the door for causal relationship. And just to show you the study in April 2020 that I showed you, very similar results, and this was for chances of death from COVID, and they corrected for age and they tracked back to earlier vitamin D status levels, so they did similar good science. Insufficient came in at 7.6 times the risk, and deficient came in at 10 times, and that was when corrected for all other cofactors and corrected for age, etc. So very similar. And again, shocking risk multipliers. And you'd wonder how we don't hear more about this, wouldn't you? Because, to be quite honest, risk ratios like these blow away any other putative factor in COVID severity, whether they're medications or what you eat or what you exercise or what you do. Nothing comes within a country mile of this. So remember, vitamin D is crucial. Now again, it doesn't mean chugging pills and jacking up your vitamin D a bit is going to create these magic ratios, right? Or the low ones, not necessarily. So be careful not to conflate this with jacking up your vitamin D with just supplements, because vitamin D does reflect many metabolic health phenomena. So I'll explain it now more fully. So just reminding you, by the way, that here's the results from this Israeli study, and we see the dramatic lower vitamin D in the more severe cases. Again, back in April 2020, from earlier studies, and this is another one, not the one I showed a minute ago, but another one, and you can see that the mild cases were dominated by people over 30 nanogram. And as you went lower, down to lower levels, that's the orange and the red, they dominated critical and severe and even generic ordinary level impact from COVID. So exact same outcome. And here is another way of putting it. It showed the mild outcome at an average of 33 or so nanogram, ordinary outcome below 30, severe outcome down in the 20s, which is terrible, and critical outcome down below 20, which is the no-go zone for your health. And it just noted how many Native Americans and Black Americans were in the lower below 20 category. And this tweet I sent out, and it was sent on April 6th, Eric Hempstead or Hermstead MD, and it was typical of my experts and doctors and MDs in the field. Does an adequate vitamin D level protect against some of the cytokine storm we're seeing with COVID-19? I'll say, I don't know. Fair enough. I just haven't seen any vitamin D levels in the 40s or higher yet on any patient I've admitted with it. And he did quite a few. And he'd be interested to know if others are seeing the same. And I think we know from the studies and anecdotally from all over the world, yeah, over 40, you can kind of forget about being really worried about this quite nasty disease. So here's the explanation of why at a high level, and to emphasize it ain't just supplements. And I was just showing here from an earlier study, the over 30 nanogram people, how can they magically be 10 times lower risk of death or 14 times lower risk of severity? That's huge. What's wrong, or why are the good guys so much better off than the below 20 guys? And I'll explain. Well, if you eat nutrient-dense, D-rich foods, as it happens, then you will tend to be a high vitamin D person in the blood test. And paleomedicine and Hungary have shown that by improving people's metabolic health without supplements or so on, their vitamin D naturally rises up. So it reflects eating the healthiest ancestral human foods. That's one reason why you'd end up in the above 30 club. The second thing is, if you have insulin resistance or any associated conditions, your vitamin D level can go right down. So if you don't have these problems, if you're living healthily and the right way, as I would prescribe, then you'll tend to be in the good group with a high vitamin D. If you have any of these conditions, inflammatory conditions, again, you will tend to drive down your vitamin D level in the blood test. So if you avoid these conditions by kind of doing the stuff to avoid these ones, by kind of doing the healthy, kind of low carb diet and getting your vitamins and minerals, you will tend to end up in this group. Okay, so another reason. Of course, healthy sun exposure with no burning. Burning is not good at all, but a light pinkness max, and generally just don't get burnt at all in the slightest, but get as much healthy sun as you can, which is good for so many photochemicals in your body and nitric oxide and so many things for health. We evolved in the sun, so healthy sun exposure, if you get plenty of that in season or even out of season with other methods like, you know, lamps and stuff, you will tend to end up in this lucky group. And finally, yes, if you take supplements, you will drive up your vitamin D status and you will tend more to be in this group. But we got to be careful. The first four things I mentioned, you can't skip all of those. Supplement alone is fine if you're deficient and you want to get up quickly, but you got to be thinking these things too. That's where the magic is. So, my talk, D is for debacle, when I first researched this back in 2014, is available on YouTube. It's got a lot of views and it's really detailed on every aspect of vitamin D metabolism. So for the people who want to know it all, there you go. And I did a lot of custom diagrams like these to help explain it. So I'll put the link in the description box below. And here's some graphs I had from back then, and this shows the Maasai in earlier studies, ancestral people living healthily, and hey presto, they had men around 42 nanogram on average, right? And the minimum line is around 30. But their genetic cousins who are genetically the same, the Bantu who live in the cities and eat the processed food and they wear the clothes all the time, guess what? They're down around 24 on average. So it's very easy to go from human ancestral level down to a very poor level. Just eat processed food and stuff, get a bit insulin resistant, keep covered up and don't get healthy sun, yada, yada, yada. Nothing to do with supplements. And this illustrates it beautifully. So here's Wyoming athletes. I think it was a great indicator. It's not black or African. These were Caucasians. And you see that these healthy athletes, no supplementation, but out in the sun, I think it was Wyoming, yes, you got the males up around 42 and you got the females up around 50. And this is the human ancestral healthy level. So I don't want to beat it to death, but it's pretty obvious, right? You want to be well above 30 in a comfortable zone, reflecting your great metabolic health, your diet, your exercise, your sun exposure, all the good things in life that blow away medications in terms of giving you a long, healthy life. So here's an amazing study I showed back then, and it shows the NHANES US database around the late 80s. And here are the bars showing the percentage of various peoples that were above 30. So the percentage above 30 in the population. And we won't bother with age. We'll look at race and ethnicity because this is very relevant in the viral issue and COVID generally. We've seen that, you know, BAME populations and people of colour, etc., much harder hit in general. So anyway, back in NHANES, late 80s, you had Caucasians up 50% or above 30. Not too bad. Black people, sadly, only around 12%. And then Mexican American, another, you know, around 30%. But guess what happened in only around 12 or 14 years till the next survey? Well, this happened. It collapsed. The percentage of people above 30 essentially collapsed. And you can imagine what it's like now in 2022. Across the board, certainly for Caucasian people, but look what happened for black people. Already only 12% above 30 nanogram. Only 12%, but now it's down to around 3 or 4% are above 30. So this is a catastrophe for black people's health, and we all know that now. And again, other kind of various ethnicities, a collapse by the early 2000s, and probably much worse now. So remember our Maasai up at 42? This is where he'd be on this graph, right? Off the scale, pretty much 100% above 30. Well, high 90s, okay? Winning the vitamin D jackpot for ancestral health. Do you think this guy's going to come down with a bad dose of COVID? Severe? I don't think so. So, other slides I shared back then, and I also showed the importance of the sun in general across many, many hormones and glands. And I showed that the USA population, as we said, 70% are insufficient below 30. And 15 years previously, it was only 50%. So it's a disaster. And it's part of our last 2 years of disaster is intimately connected to this. Evolutionarily, we evolved in the incredibly hot high UV tropics, and that's where we came from around 60,000 years ago. And then we migrated, and when we lost the high UV flux, we lost the pigmentation that protected us from the severe sun, and we lowered our vitamin D. So nature responded, dropped the pigmentation accordingly with the UV level, and basically allowed us to keep generating vitamin D as we moved all over the planet. And that's just the way it is. Italy, when we get back to our COVID issue, you remember Italy got hit so hard. It's an aged population, but that's not the only reason they got hit pretty hard in northern Italy. So Italy, from a publication, has one of the worst vitamin D deficiency rates in Europe. Direct quote. A study of Italian women aged 60 to 80 found values of vitamin D lower than 5 nanogram per mil in 27% of the women, and lower than 12 nanogram in as many as 76% of the women tested. This was a study on older people, often in residential type homes. I mean, these nanogram levels are just in the toilet. Another one, which looked at postmenopausal women, found 32% of healthy women and up to 82% of patients in long-term neuro rehabilitation were pretty much seriously hypovitaminosis D, which is really low levels, like down at 12 or so. Japan, it was very dramatically different. It got up to 50% antibody positivity through their wave in the summer of 2020, or autumn, European autumn, but they got very little impact. Japan's recovery rates were 7 times higher than deaths. In all other northern territories, deaths and recovery rates have followed a 1-to-1 ratio. So this was observed. Japan is getting away with murder. Japan also has a strikingly low incidence of vitamin D deficiency versus Europe. And they attributed that to fish, but also metabolic health, as I mentioned earlier, would allow your vitamin D to be much higher, even with the same kind of sun exposure. Prevalence of D in another study less than 12 nanogram in women over 30 years old is only 10%. Prevalence of vitamin D less than 30 in active elderly in another study was below 5%. So, I mean, these don't line up perfectly, but generally Japan is health focused and has avoided the processed food disaster, and they generally are relatively very high across the population. In Europe, one other quote, vitamin D lower than 10 nanogram. Lower than 10 nanogram was found in 2 to 30% of adults, but this percentage may increase to 75% or more in older persons in institutions. And that's where the vast bulk of the COVID problem had its most severe blows, as we all know. So just one last little thing, vitamin D, of course, status tracks with influenza season in Europe quite dramatically. You can see this paper I featured back in 2014, and quite a dramatic relationship, but not a proof. But with all the mechanistic science of vitamin D in the immune system, it makes sense. And there was 1 or 2 studies on vitamin D supplementation looking at influenza, and quite small studies. Here's one I featured, but it did show quite a dramatic effect, it appeared, and it was an RCT, so it wasn't associational. So it's nice to kind of look at it and wonder, what if we did more RCTs using like 5,000 and using UV and sun and the other things I mentioned, and looking at a control group versus the people who got all of the good stuff. And I think you'd see a dramatic difference in severity of influenza the following season. So, just to recap, because this is important, it ain't just the supplements, guys. Don't fall into the trap of thinking magic supplements will give you magic group outcomes. It's eating of healthy, ancestral, nutrient-dense foods and avoiding insulin resistance. Avoiding insulin resistance, that's huge in having a higher vitamin D level, right? And it's the biggest disease process pretty much on Earth. So that's a huge one. Avoiding these inflammatory conditions, and again, you can't avoid certain things, but they're all related to the human immune system and inflammation, and do what you can. If you eat real foods, you don't eat any processed foods, and you get magnesium, potassium, and various other zinc and many other vitamins and minerals, you know, DHA, EPA, fish oil. If you do all the good stuff, you're going to mitigate these in any case. So you'll put yourself more in this group. And healthy sun exposure. As per Professor Hollick, a wonderful man who discovered the metabolite vitamin D way back decades ago, has given many talks on getting healthy sun. No burning, no risk of cancer, don't burn. Get as much healthy sun as you can without burning, and that will give you nitric oxide, vasodilation. It will give you arterial health that's been proven in studies, and also give you vitamin D, and also multiple other photoproducts that they haven't even studied yet, which I'm sure evolution designed to be important for our health. And finally, yes, of course, 5 or 10,000 for someone who's very deficient per day. And it's important, and this is the final point I'll give you. The half-life of D3 in the blood, when you eat the vitamin or you get it from sun, it's D3. And the half-life is only a day or two. So you can't take a super dose every week or month. That doesn't work, because it has to go to your liver and be converted in a slower process into the active metabolite 25-OHD. So you really kind of have to have a more consistent daily routine so that your liver can convert and build up your 25-OHD, which is the thing measured in the blood test. So on supplements, don't be depending on supplements alone, because they will not get the magic that all of these four things will. And the second thing is, on supplements and in general, daily routine is very important for D3, and that has been shown by Professor Hollick, Professor Hollis, and all the other top professors who are experts in this extraordinary pre-hormone and its effect on our health. So, more to come, always sharing the science. Thanks so much to my Patreon and PayPal supporters. Helps keep the train the track, helps keep the show going. And of course, we need to do this, because if independent scientific and technical experts can't get good information out there, how do you work against the fire hose, the torrent of misleading information from mass media, pharma and food industry and all the others? There's no conspiracy theory. These guys are all running a business, and I understand that. And they need to bias all the data and findings towards making their business successful. And I understand that. But we do need to have balance, and we need to have, you know, unbiased, independent people coming out with the data, explaining the data, so that people have a choice whether to go with the biased stuff or whether they go with the unbiased stuff. At least they have a choice. They can use their brain. They can weigh things up. And that's very important in a modern, Western, free democracy and everywhere. So anyway, rant over. Thanks so much to my supporters. And please do hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. That helps things in the algorithms. And hit the little notification bell also, so that you can get updates when I bring out new material. Thank you.